He spent 2 years pushing the woman he loved into another man's arms, not because he didn't want her, not because she didn't want him, but because Gideon Mercer had decided, without asking her, that he wasn't good enough to deserve her. And she let him believe that, until the night a storm tore her roof apart, and she watched him climb into the dark and the rain on a bad leg that had no business climbing anything. That was the night Naomi Ashcroft stopped being patient. That was the night everything broke open. Stay with me until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The spring mud in Red Hollow had a particular way of announcing itself. Thick, dark, and unforgiving. It crept under every door in town and clung to every boot heel like it had a personal grudge. By April, the main road between the tannery and the post office was closer to a creek than a street, and the men who had to cross it daily had developed a specific walk that involved lifted knees and low curses and absolutely no dignity whatsoever. Gideon Mercer crossed that mud every single morning at 5:15. He had to. His shop opened at 6, and the leather didn't tan itself, and there were orders stacked 3 weeks deep on the workbench that he'd built with his own hands from salvaged barn wood. The shop was small, one front room for customers, one back room where the real work happened, and it smelled of tallow and oak bark, and the particular kind of tired that seeps into wood over years of use. Gideon had been in that shop for 11 years, long enough that the smell had gotten into his clothes and his hair, and probably his dreams, though he would have been the last person to say something like that out loud. He was 48 years old, and he moved like a man who had made a quiet agreement with pain somewhere along the way. The limp was old, older than Red Hollow, older than his time out west, a souvenir from a horse that had decided on one particularly stupid afternoon in his late 20s that it was done being ridden. The leg had healed wrong, or not quite right, or somewhere in between, and now it was just part of him, like his gray-streaked hair and the calluses on his right palm, and the habit he had of going very still when he was thinking hard about something. Most people in Red Hollow had stopped noticing the limp years ago. Most people in Red Hollow had stopped noticing Gideon years ago, if he was being honest, which he usually was, even when it cost him something. He was the kind of man a town relies on without realizing it. The fence at the Henley property got repaired every spring. Nobody quite knew who did it. The ice in front of Mrs. Garfield's steps disappeared before she woke up every cold morning. Nobody thought to ask. Small things, quiet things, the kind of things that didn't make good conversation at the Sunday social, but that kept a community from fraying at the edges. Gideon never told anyone about any of it, partly because it wasn't the kind of thing you announced, partly because he genuinely did not want the credit, and partly, though he would have denied this if pressed, because the only person he cared about noticing had a bakery to run and 3 employees to manage and 140 pounds of flour delivered every Tuesday that needed to be checked and sorted and stacked before the morning rush. Naomi Ashcroft's bakery sat at the corner of 2nd Street and Mill Road, which meant that Gideon's route to his shop took him past it every single morning, had taken him past it for 2 years, long enough that he'd memorized the exact moment her lamps came on, 4:45, reliable as a clock, and the particular smell of the first bread coming out of the oven, which reached the street somewhere around 5:15 and was, in Gideon's private estimation, the finest smell in the known world. He did not stop and tell her that. He walked past. He nodded, on the morning she happened to be at the door. She nodded back. Sometimes she said his name. He said hers. And then he kept walking, because that was the arrangement he had made with himself, and he was a man who kept his arrangements. The thing about Naomi Ashcroft was that she was not what people expected. Red Hollow had a certain idea of widows. Quiet, careful women who faded gradually into the background of the town's social life, who were grateful for small courtesies, who remarried when a reasonable offer presented itself and did not make too much noise in the meantime. Red Hollow had produced several such widows, and they were very much appreciated by everyone. Naomi was not one of them. She had come to Red Hollow 4 years ago with $37, a set of cast iron pans, and the particular expression of a woman who has recently survived something she does not intend to discuss in detail. She had rented the empty building on the corner from old Marcus Webb for what was, by all accounts, an unreasonably reasonable monthly figure, a negotiation that had left Marcus looking faintly bewildered and slightly relieved, which was the usual aftermath of dealing with Naomi on business matters. She had opened the bakery 6 weeks later. It had been busy from the first morning and had gotten busier every month since. This was not an accident. Naomi worked the way some people prayed, consistently, early, and with an attention to detail that brooked no shortcuts. She was 35 years old and had dark hair she usually kept pinned up, and eyes that were a particular shade of brown that shifted in different light, and a mouth that had been described variously as stubborn, direct, and, on one memorable occasion by a traveling salesman who had tried to argue about a price, distressingly non-negotiable. She had taken that last one as a compliment, which probably told you most of what you needed to know about Naomi Ashcroft. She had also in those 4 years learned the names and food preferences of every regular customer, fixed her own plumbing twice, hired 3 local girls who couldn't find other work, extended credit to half a dozen families during hard months without ever making them feel the weight of the debt, and built a reputation for honey bread that people rode 6 miles specifically to purchase. She had done none of this to impress anyone. She'd done it because it needed doing, and because she was, at her core, a person who finished what she started. What she had not done in those 4 years was let anyone particularly close. This was also not an accident. The first time Gideon did something that made her actually stop and look at him, really look at him, not just the polite neighbor look she gave most people, was a Tuesday morning in February, 8 months after she'd arrived in Red Hollow. It had been a brutal winter, the kind that came down from the northern mountains with genuine malice and settled in for months. The steps in front of her bakery had developed a sheet of ice that she'd been chipping at every morning with a hand axe, because the salt she'd ordered hadn't arrived and the ice had no interest in waiting. She'd been doing this for 3 mornings running, in the dark, in temperatures that made her fingers stop cooperating properly, and she was developing a genuine and personal hatred for that particular patch of ground. On the 4th morning, she came out with her hand axe, and there was no ice. The steps were clear. Not just scraped, clear, all the way to the road, with sand spread evenly over the stones so that it wouldn't get slippery again immediately. She stood there for a moment, hand axe in hand, and looked at the steps. Then she looked up and down the street. There was nobody there. There was, in fact, nothing to indicate who had done this except a set of boot prints in the thin snow at the edge of the road. A particular pattern, an uneven gait, right foot landing heavier than the left. She filed that away. She didn't say anything to anyone. The following Tuesday, the ice was back. She came out with her axe. The ice was there for one morning only. She never had to chip her steps again that winter. She didn't say anything to Gideon about it, but she started watching him differently. Not in a way that was obvious. Naomi was not an obvious person, but carefully, the way she watched bread in the oven, paying attention to the process of something happening. And what she saw, over the months that followed, was a man who moved through the world like he was trying not to take up too much of it. He was quiet in a way that was different from shy. It wasn't that he didn't have things to say, it was that he seemed to have made some calculation about when talking was useful and come up with a number much lower than most people. He was careful with his hands in the way that people are when their hands are their livelihood. He was unfailingly courteous to the older residents and completely impervious to the social maneuverings of the younger ones, which was unusual in a man his age, and in Naomi's experience indicated either great self-possession or profound obliviousness. She eventually concluded it was the former. She started leaving bread for him on Tuesday mornings. Nothing announced. A small wrapped loaf on the bench outside his shop when she walked past, which she had started doing occasionally for no particular reason she cared to name. He never mentioned it. She never mentioned it. But the wrapping always came back folded neatly and left on the bench, which was not the behavior of someone who hadn't noticed. This was, for a while, the entire nature of their relationship, and they were both too stubborn and too careful to acknowledge that it had become something else. The change in everything, the thing that upset the careful balance they'd constructed, was named Edmund Hale. He arrived in Red Hollow on a Thursday in early March, 2 years after Naomi had opened her bakery, on a horse that was too expensive for a frontier town and wearing a coat that was only slightly less expensive than the horse. He was 32 years old, with the kind of face that made women look twice and made men immediately start listing his probable flaws. And he had come to open the first real bank Red Hollow had managed to attract, which meant the town council met him with the particular enthusiasm usually reserved for rainfall after a long dry spell. His name was Edmund Hale, And within 2 weeks, he had had a private conversation with every person of consequence in Red Hollow, given small loans to 3 families who needed them, organized a community meeting about road improvements, and somehow managed to be charming to everyone simultaneously without it seeming calculated, which was, Gideon had to admit privately, a fairly impressive feat. Edmund Hale also, very obviously, had decided that Naomi Ashcroft was the most interesting thing in Red Hollow. Gideon noticed this on the second Saturday of Edmund's residency, when the banker stopped at the bakery not once but twice and lingered both times with the particular focus of a man who has found something he wants to return to. He noticed it, and he felt something drop in his chest like a stone thrown into cold water. And then he made himself go very still inside the way he did when he was thinking hard about something, and he reasoned it through. Edmund Hale was 32. He was established and confident and did not limp when he walked. He had a good income and a respectable profession and a face that caused no difficulties whatsoever. He would give Naomi a stable future. He would probably give her that porch she'd mentioned once, quietly, in passing, that she'd always wanted to have, somewhere to sit in the evenings and watch the light change over the hills. He was, by any reasonable measurement, an excellent option. Gideon was 48. He had a small shop and a bad leg and calluses and a scar on his left forearm from a tanning accident, and the memory of one spectacular rejection burned so deep into him that he could still feel it on cold mornings, which in Red Hollow was most mornings. He smelled of leather and tallow. He had no particular charm and no particular speeches, and nothing much to offer except a quietness that most people didn't have a use for. He made the decision the way he made most decisions, quickly, privately, and with the full weight of his considerable stubbornness behind it. Edmund Hale was going to court Naomi Ashcroft, and Gideon was going to help him do it properly. He wasn't entirely sure, looking back, what he had thought this would feel like. In theory, it had seemed like a sacrifice worth making, giving her something better than he could provide, even at cost to himself. That was the shape of it in his head. Clean, practical. The kind of thing a man did when he was clear-eyed about what he was and wasn't. In practice, it felt like hammering a nail through his own hand every single day. He started small. He mentioned to Edmund, in the casual way of men who had been in town longer, that the bakery on 2nd Street was worth stopping at, that the woman who ran it was sharp and reliable and worth knowing. Edmund needed no particular encouragement, but Gideon provided it anyway. He told him what bread she was proudest of, and what time the morning rush settled down, and that she respected directness more than flattery, which was information he'd spent 2 years carefully accumulating and was now handing off like change across a counter. Edmund listened to all of it and thanked him for it with a smile that was entirely genuine, which somehow made it worse. "She's something, isn't she?" Edmund said, on the 3rd or 4th of these conversations, with the easy confidence of a man who had no particular reason to doubt himself. "She is," Gideon said. He didn't say anything else. He went back to his shop and he worked until 8 o'clock that evening, and he didn't think about it, which was a lie he told himself successfully for about 40 minutes before giving up. The conversations with Naomi were harder. She came to his shop one afternoon in April, the first time she'd ever come inside, as opposed to walking past. And she looked around at the workbenches and the tools and the half-finished saddle on the stand near the window with the attentive expression she used when she was cataloging something new. She ran her finger along the edge of the workbench and looked at the quality of the stitching on a belt he had hanging by the door and said, without preamble, "You're better at this than people realize, aren't you?" It wasn't quite a question. "I do all right," Gideon said. She turned and looked at him with those brown eyes that shifted in different light, and for a moment he had the uncomfortable sensation that she was reading something he hadn't meant to put on the page. Then she said, "Edmund Hale asked if he could walk me home last Friday." Gideon kept his hands moving on the leather he was working. "Did he?" "I said yes." She paused. "He's very pleasant." "He is," Gideon said. "He's a good man, reliable. He'll be good for the town." "I wasn't asking you about the town." He did look up at that. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something that had patience in it, and something that had irritation under the patience, and something beneath that he didn't trust himself to identify correctly. "He's a better prospect than most," Gideon said carefully. "You deserve someone who can offer you something solid." "And what?" Naomi said very evenly. Do you imagine you know about what I deserve? The question hung between them. Gideon felt it settle in the air like the smell of rain before a storm. I know what you've built here, he said. 4 years of your own work. You don't need to take chances on someone who can't match that. You're talking about yourself. I'm talking about practical matters. You're doing it again, she said. Doing what? Deciding things for me. She straightened and picked up her basket from the chair where she'd set it. I didn't ask for your assessment of Edmund Hale, Gideon. I came to tell you something, and you turned it into a lesson about my future before I got halfway through a sentence. He opened his mouth, closed it. He's very pleasant, she said again, at the door. But pleasant isn't the same as dependable, and I have done considerable research on that distinction. She left. The door swung shut behind her. Gideon stood in the middle of his shop with a half-finished belt in his hands, and the particular feeling of a man who has missed something important but can't quite work out what. He told himself he'd misunderstood her. That was easier. He told himself she was being polite, being kind, offering him a courtesy she extended to most people in Red Hollow, because that was her nature. She was not implying anything specific. She was certainly not telling him that she found Edmund Hale merely pleasant, while looking at Gideon Mercer like he was a problem she was working on solving. He told himself this for approximately 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, he continued helping Edmund. He mentioned that Naomi's birthday was in May and that she would not, under any circumstances, want a fuss made about it, but that she had once said, very offhandedly, that she hadn't had apple cake since she left the East. He mentioned this specifically and deliberately and hated himself for every word of it. Edmund thanked him and had an apple cake made at the restaurant on 4th Street and brought it to the bakery on a Tuesday morning. And Naomi's face did a complicated thing that Gideon, watching from across the street with a length of leather in his hands and no particular reason to be standing outside, could not interpret. What he did not know, because he had turned away before he saw it, was that Naomi's complicated expression resolved itself, once Edmund had gone inside, into something remarkably close to exasperation. Thus, the actual conversation, the one that broke something open between them that couldn't be easily closed again, happened on a Wednesday evening in early May when Gideon was carrying a repaired saddle back to the Jenkinson farm and took the long route home that went past the bakery, which was the kind of thing he had recently been telling himself he was going to stop doing and had not yet actually stopped doing. The bakery was closed. Naomi was on the small stoop at the back door, sitting on an upturned crate, with her shoes off and her feet bare against the stone step, and a cup of something warm in both hands. She had the look of a woman who has been on her feet since 4:30 in the morning and has finally been given permission to exist without accomplishing anything. She looked up when she heard his uneven step on the road. "Gideon?" she said. "Evening," he said. He should have kept walking. He knew he should have kept walking. He stopped anyway because his body had apparently made a separate and unilateral decision, and stood with the saddle over one shoulder and looked at her in the last light of the evening. "Sit down," she said. "You're making me tired just looking at you standing there." "I've got to get this back to—" "Sit down for 5 minutes." She nodded at the other crate. "It won't kill the Jenkinsons to wait another half hour." He sat down. The crate was low and his bad leg didn't appreciate the angle, but he found a position that was tolerable and settled into it, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the evening did what evenings in spring do, which is proceed very gently and with no urgency at all. "Edmund asked to take me to the spring dance," Naomi said finally. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it." She looked at the cup in her hands. "He's very attentive." "He's a good man," Gideon said, and hated the words even as he said them because they were true, and that was the worst part. "You keep saying that." "Because it's true. Gideon." She said his name in a particular way, not sharp but not soft either, measured, the way she measured flour, because she knew what the wrong amount did to the outcome. "Do you think I don't notice things?" He didn't answer. "I notice things," she said. "I notice a great many things. I notice, for instance, that my steps have been clear of ice every single winter morning for 2 years, and that the list of people who are awake at 4 in the morning and have a particular way of walking is fairly short." She paused. "I noticed that when my flour order came in damaged last September, there was a note from the supplier saying the cost of the ruined bags had already been covered, and I noticed that the man who covered it did not tell me he'd done it." Gideon said nothing. His jaw was doing something tight and unhelpful. I notice, Naomi continued in the same level voice, that you have spent the better part of 2 months helping a man court me. And I am trying to decide whether that makes you remarkably selfless or remarkably stupid. Naomi, I haven't finished. She set her cup down on the step with a small, decisive click. You are going to tell me that Edmund Hale is a better option. You are going to say something about what I deserve and what makes practical sense and what kind of future I should be considering. I know this because you have been running that same calculation since March and reaching the same conclusion every time. She looked at him directly. I am asking you to stop. He can give me charming conversation and a good income and a very pleasant evening at a dance, she said. I am 35 years old. I have had a charming man. I know exactly what that costs. She picked up her cup again. I'm not interested in what Edmund Hale can give me. I am interested in knowing what is going on behind your eyes when you look at me, because whatever it is, you have been working very hard to pretend it isn't there. And frankly, Gideon, I am tired of watching you do that. The evening went very quiet. Or maybe it wasn't quiet. Maybe the birds were still going and the distant sound of the town was still present. But it felt quiet to Gideon, the way things go quiet when the thing you've been afraid of for 2 years is sitting on a crate across from you with bare feet and steady eyes. I'm not a good option, he said finally. The words came out rough, like they'd been sitting unused and the hinges had gotten stiff. Says who? Says... He stopped, turned the sentence over. Couldn't find a way to finish it that sounded reasonable out loud. I'm 20 years older than he is? 13. I have a bad leg and a small shop, and I have flour in my hair at 6 in the morning, and I'm sometimes sharp with people before I've had my coffee, and I built an entire life out of nothing because the man I married spent what little we had on prospects that never materialized. She was not angry when she said this. She was remarkably matter-of-fact about it, which somehow made it more serious than anger. I don't need someone with a good income, Gideon. I have one. I built it. What I need... She stopped, reconsidered, took a breath. What I want is someone whose word means something. Someone who does the thing without being asked and doesn't want a speech made about it afterward. She looked at him. You understand what I'm telling you? He did. That was the problem. He understood exactly what she was telling him, and he believed she meant it. And he also believed, with the deep, stubborn certainty of a man who had been wrong before and paid for it at length, that she would eventually understand that she was settling for something less than she deserved. And then he would become the thing she regretted, and he could not become that for her. You'd be taking a chance on someone who might not be what you think he is, he said. Everyone is a chance, she said. That's what a person is. Naomi. Gideon. Her voice had something final in it now, not angry, but finished, the way a door closing sounds different from a door slamming. I am going to the dance with Edmund because you keep pushing me toward it, and I am going to go, and I am going to know what I already know, which is that pleasant is not the same as what I'm looking for. She stood up, bare feet on the stone step, and looked down at him. When you're ready to stop making decisions on my behalf, I'll be right here. She went inside. The door closed behind her. Gideon sat on the crate in the gathering dark for a long time, the saddle across his knees, not going anywhere. He went home. He told himself he had done the right thing. He told himself she was being kind, that what she felt toward him was gratitude and familiarity and the natural warmth of a woman with a generous nature, and that he was reading something into it that wasn't there because he had wanted it to be there for 2 years, and wanting something hard enough could make you see it in places it didn't exist. He'd been wrong before about what a woman wanted from him, spectacularly wrong, in the way of a young man who had believed he was enough, and discovered in one painful afternoon that he wasn't. He'd been 26. He'd spent 22 years making sure he didn't put himself in that position again. He wasn't going to start now. He went back to helping Edmund. He told himself it was the right thing. He told himself that all through May, and he half believed it, and some mornings he believed it completely, and some mornings he walked past the bakery at 5:15 and smelled the bread and felt something that had no simple name for it, and he just kept walking. Edmund Hale took Naomi to the spring dance. She wore a blue dress that Gideon did not see because he had found a very pressing reason to be elsewhere that evening. Edmund brought her home and stood on her step for 10 minutes, which was visible from the road, in the dark, to a man who happened to be walking home from the shop and took a route that went past the bakery, and it was 10 minutes that felt like considerably longer. She did not invite him in, but she also, the next day in the afternoon, walked into Gideon's shop without knocking and said, "He wants to call on me formally. What do you think I should do?" Gideon set down his tools. He looked at her. She was looking at him with that expression again, patient on top, something else underneath. And he thought, not for the first time, that Naomi Ashcroft was one of the most dangerous people he had ever known, because she had an absolute gift for asking questions that were not the question they appeared to be. "He's a good man," Gideon said, for what felt like the 40th time. Something moved in her face. There and gone. "Right," she said. "Thank you." She walked out. He didn't watch her go. He picked up his tools and went back to work, and he did not allow himself to think about the thing that had moved in her face, or what it meant, or why. 3 hours later, he was still thinking about it despite having specifically decided not to. The weeks that followed had a particular quality to them that Gideon recognized as the feeling of something he'd already broken trying to mend itself wrong. He went to work. He came home. He cleared ice and repaired fences and left bread money for the Whitmore family, who were 3 months behind and would not have asked for help if the alternative was starvation. He worked. He didn't think. He told himself he was doing the right thing. The town, for its part, watched all of this with the focused attention of a community that has correctly identified that something interesting is happening and is waiting for the conclusion. Red Hollow was small enough that private matters were a courtesy fiction, and everyone knew it. The women at the general store discussed Naomi's situation with the seriousness usually reserved for weather patterns and crop forecasts. The men at the feed store were somewhat less verbal about it, but no less attentive. The consensus, as near as could be determined, was that Edmund Hale was a perfectly acceptable option, but that Gideon Mercer was an idiot, a conclusion reached through various routes but consistently arrived at. Nobody told Gideon this directly. They wouldn't have. He was, in the specific way of men who do not invite confidence, someone who people talked about rather than to, not because they didn't like him, but because he projected a self-sufficiency so convincing that it made confiding in him feel somehow rude. He was alone in this. He didn't know he was alone in it. He kept walking past the bakery at 5:15. He kept nodding when she was at the door. She kept nodding back. But the small conversations they'd had, the ones that had started with the steps and the bread and built into something he hadn't named because naming it felt dangerous, those had gone quieter, more careful, with the particular quality of ground that looks solid and isn't. Edmund Hale called on her 3 times formally in May. The town observed this with great interest. Gideon observed it with his jaw set and his hands busy, and the firm private conviction that he was doing the right thing by all parties, which was a conviction he held with decreasing confidence as June arrived and the evenings got longer and the road from his shop to his house continued to take him by the most direct route possible that just happened to go past the bakery, through the corner of 2nd and Mill. He was, as the woman at the general store said to the woman at the milliner's one Tuesday morning, the stubbornest man she'd ever seen, and she'd been married to a mule for 30 years, referring to her late husband with uncharacteristic ambiguity. The storm came in June. It started in the late afternoon, 3 days into the month, with the particular green quality that the sky gets before something serious happens with weather. By the time Gideon locked up his shop at 7:30, it had developed into a genuine consideration, with wind coming down from the northern range and pressure dropping in the way that made his bad leg ache with the particular accuracy of a barometer. He looked at the sky on the way home. The sky looked back without apology. He made himself dinner, salt pork and bread, and a cup of coffee that was several hours old and had achieved a consistency closer to axle grease than beverage. He sat at his table. He listened to the wind picking up outside. He thought about the bakery roof. He'd noticed 3 weeks ago that 2 of the wooden shingles on the north-facing slope were loose. He'd noticed it in the particular way he noticed things about her property, which was involuntarily and with more detail than was strictly necessary. He'd thought at the time that he should say something to her about it. He'd decided not to because saying something about her roof would have required a conversation that would have led somewhere he'd decided he wasn't going to go. He sat at his table. The wind outside went from consideration to commitment. He thought about two loose shingles on a north-facing slope in a serious wind. He thought about it for approximately 4 minutes. Then he got up, put on his coat, and went out into the rain. It was raining properly by the time he reached the bakery. Not the apologetic kind of rain that Red Hollow usually produced, but the serious kind, the kind with intent, that came horizontal off the mountains in sheets that made noise when they hit. The wind was 40 miles an hour if it was 10, and Gideon had his head down and his collar up and could see approximately far enough in front of him to not walk into anything at below knee height. The bakery looked wrong from half a block away. There was a sound, not the sound of rain or wind, but something structural, a groan and a sharp crack that went up his spine before his brain had processed it. He moved faster. His bad leg protested this at length, and he ignored it at length, which was the usual arrangement. The north corner of the roof had lifted. Not collapsed, lifted like a lid, the shingles peeling back in a section about 8 feet wide and showing the raw wood underneath, which was already darkening with water. Even from the road he could see it, and he could see what it meant. If that section let go properly, water would get into the structure, into the walls, into the floor. 2 weeks of spring rain with an open roof in Naomi's bakery would be a rebuilding job, not a repair. He went around the back of the building. There was a ladder in the small yard. He'd seen it there before, propped against the back wall. And he pulled it out and set it against the eave. And then he stood for a moment and looked up at the roof in the rain and had a brief but comprehensive conversation with himself about whether this was wise. The conversation concluded that it was not wise, that it was possibly the least wise thing he'd proposed to himself in a decade, that his leg was already aching from the walk over, and that none of this was relevant because the shingles were not going to wait for him to make a better decision. He started climbing. He was on the second rung when the back door of the bakery opened and Naomi came out with a lamp and an expression he could not see clearly in the rain and the dark. "Gideon?" Her voice cut through the wind. "Go inside," he said. "What are you? Your north corner is lifting. Go inside and get something to catch water under the beams." "The ladder isn't, it's not, you can't." She was looking at his leg, he knew, though in the rain he couldn't see her face. "Gideon, your leg. I'm already on it," he said. "Go get something for the floor." There was a silence. He climbed another rung. His bad leg shook on the third step, and he moved his weight fast and found his balance and kept going. "I'm coming up," she said. He looked down. She had set the lamp inside the door where the rain wouldn't reach it, and she was at the bottom of the ladder in the dark, and the rain with her hair already plastered flat and her jaw set in the expression he associated with her position on non-negotiable matters. "Naomi, move," she said, "before it goes completely." He moved. She followed, and the two of them went up into the dark and the storm together. Gideon with his bad leg and his hands on the wet wood and his jaw tight against the pane, and Naomi right behind him, steady and unhesitating, because she was that kind of person and had always been that kind of person. And he had just apparently been too busy pushing her toward someone else to let himself believe it. They worked for 4 hours. It was not graceful. It was not quiet. It involved a significant number of words that Naomi had not expected to know and that Gideon had apparently picked up during a decade of frontier life and was deploying under pressure without his usual filter. The lifted section had to be battened down with boards he found in the yard, nailed at angles that made his arms burn, in rain that was actively trying to prevent him from seeing what he was doing. His leg gave out entirely on the 3rd hour, and he sat flat on the roof with his good leg braced and kept working from there, because the alternative was stopping, and stopping wasn't an option. Naomi handed him nails when he needed them. She held sections of board when he needed 2 hands. She made no comments about his leg and did not suggest he come down and did not offer sympathy he hadn't asked for. And all of that was exactly right, in a way he couldn't have explained but felt clearly. At some point it stopped raining. He didn't notice immediately. He became aware of the quiet gradually, the absence of the sound he'd been working against, and he straightened carefully and looked out over the roof at Red Hollow, in the dark, dripping and battered and present. Naomi was beside him, sitting on the ridge with her knees up and her hands on her thighs and her hair hanging straight and wet, and she was looking at him. Not the practical look she'd been using all night. The other look. The one he kept deciding he was misreading. "Your hands are bleeding," she said. He looked down. The nails had caught him somewhere in the middle hours, and he hadn't registered it. "It's fine. You could have told me about the shingles 3 weeks ago," she said, "when you first noticed." He looked at her. He opened his mouth and closed it. "You noticed 3 weeks ago," she said. "It wasn't a question. I saw you looking at the roof. And you didn't say anything, and I know why you didn't say anything, and I need you to hear me very clearly, Gideon." She was very still in the way that still bodies are sometimes more forceful than moving ones. "I am not a woman who needs to be protected from her own feelings. I am not fragile. I am not confused, and I am not—" Her voice didn't change, but there was something in it that was almost fervent now, almost fierce. "I am not settling." He didn't say anything. "You have spent 2 years," she said, "doing more for me than any man I have ever known, and then convincing yourself it doesn't count because you don't think you're the right option. You're deciding that for both of us, and you have been doing it without asking me, and I have been patient about it because I am generally a patient person. But Gideon, I am on a roof in the middle of the night, and I am wet, and I am tired, and I would like you to stop." The dark around them was very quiet. Below, Red Hollow was dark and still, and had no opinion to offer. Gideon looked at his bleeding hands. "I'm not Edmund Hale," he said finally. "No," she said. "You are not." She said it with a completeness that was not unkind. "You are the man who showed up on my roof in a storm, on a bad leg, and worked for 4 hours without being asked. Edmund Hale was asleep." She paused. "I know, because I am quite certain that if Edmund Hale had been awake during this storm, he would have found a way to mention it." Something that was not quite a smile happened at the corner of his mouth. "I'm older than him," Gideon said, because apparently there was still more self-sabotage available. 13 years, Naomi said. "I can count." She stood up, carefully, on the wet roof, and looked down at him sitting with his bad legs stretched out and his hands bleeding and his hair in his eyes, and she said, "You are the most difficult man I have ever tried to care about." The words went into him and settled somewhere past the arguing. "Naomi," he said. "Still right here," she said. "Still waiting." He looked at her on that roof in the dark, wet and tired and utterly certain of herself, and something in him that had been held very still for a very long time moved, finally, without his permission. He didn't say the perfect thing. He didn't say much at all, actually. He said her name again, and she sat back down beside him on the ridge of the roof she owned, and they stayed there in the dark without it needing to be anything more than what it was, which was, in its own quiet way, everything. He walked home at 2 a.m. with bleeding hands and a leg that was going to give him a very thorough review of the night's events for the next several days. The streets were empty and wet and smelled of rain and clean earth, the way they always did after a serious storm. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel resolved. He felt the way a man feels after 4 hours of hard work in the dark, emptied out and aching and more honest than he usually allowed himself to be. He had not made her any promises. She had not asked him to. They had not made any declarations up there on the roof or drawn any conclusions or determined anything except that they were both wet and it had stopped raining and the shingles would hold until morning. But something had changed. He knew it, and he knew she knew it, and he was going to have to sit with the fact of it, the fact of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and had decided, for reasons he still couldn't entirely accept, that what she wanted included him, and figure out what a man who had spent 20 years being very careful about exactly this did with that information. He got home. He wrapped his hands. He sat at his table. He thought about a roof in the rain and a woman who had handed him nails without commentary, and the things she'd said. "You are the most difficult man I have ever tried to care about." He sat with it for a long time. Outside, Red Hollow dripped and settled back into the dark, and the night went on the way nights do, without asking anyone's permission, and without making any promises about what the morning would look like. He sat there a while longer. Then he went to bed. He woke up the next morning with his hand stiff and his leg in open rebellion, and the particular clarity that sometimes comes after a night of not quite enough sleep. The kind of clarity that doesn't feel like a gift but functions like one anyway. He lay in bed for a few minutes longer than usual, which was not his habit. He was a man who got up when it was time to get up and didn't spend a lot of time negotiating with the morning. But that day he stayed, looking at the ceiling of his small bedroom with its one crooked beam that he'd been meaning to address for 3 years. And he thought about a wet roof and bleeding hands, and a woman who had said, "I am not settling," like it was the simplest and most obvious thing in the world. He got up. He made coffee. He went to work. Nothing had changed and everything had. And he didn't know what to do with that, so he did what he always did with things he didn't know what to do with. He set them aside and worked, and waited to see what they looked like after some time had passed. The leg was bad that morning. Worse than usual, the kind of bad that required him to move more carefully, and to take the steps down from his front door one at a time with his hand on the railing, which he generally avoided because it felt like conceding something. He conceded it that morning without much argument, because 4 hours on a wet roof at his age was apparently something the body had opinions about, and was going to express those opinions at length. He walked past the bakery at 5:15. The lamp was on. The door was closed against the morning chill. On the step, right at the corner where he would see it without having to look for it, there was a small cloth bundle tied with kitchen twine. He picked it up without stopping, untied it as he walked. Inside was a bread roll, still warm, and his hands had been wrapped last night, but not well, and she had apparently assessed this situation and come to a conclusion about it, because tucked inside the roll, which was absurd and exactly like her, was a folded piece of cotton cut from something clean, with a small tin of salve that smelled of pine resin and something he couldn't identify. He stood in the middle of the road for a moment. Then he put the salve in his pocket and ate the bread and kept walking, and something in his chest was doing something he refused to name before coffee. The town noticed the roof. Red Hollow was small enough that a significant storm followed by visible repairs to a prominent building generated the kind of community attention usually reserved for weddings or fires, and the fact that the repairs had clearly happened in the middle of the night and involved boards nailed at slightly irregular angles and a ladder left propped against the back wall of the bakery was a detail that people absorbed and discussed with great thoroughness. Nobody asked Gideon directly. They asked around him, in the way that towns do, with carefully casual questions deployed in his general direction when he stopped at the general store or the feedlot, and he deflected each one with the economy of a man who has had considerable practice. "Heard the bakery had some roof trouble," Walt Henley said at the store counter, not looking at Gideon, apparently very interested in the coffee he was buying. "Some shingles," Gideon said. "Got fixed fast." "It did." Walt Henley looked at him. Gideon looked at the jar of tobacco he was purchasing. Walt Henley had something to say and decided against it, which was the right decision. Naomi, for her part, said nothing at the bakery about the previous night. She was in the doorway when he passed, which was slightly unusual. She was normally inside at this hour. And she looked at his hands when he nodded to her, the same assessment look she'd had in the dark on the roof, checking what needed checking. He held them up briefly, showing the proper wrapping job he'd done that morning. She nodded, something satisfied in the set of her mouth, and went back inside. That was all. That was somehow exactly right. Edmund Hale came to the bakery at 8:30 that morning, as Gideon could observe from his shop window in the completely coincidental way of a man whose shop window faced that direction. Edmund was attentive and well-dressed and held the door for 2 customers on his way in, which was the kind of gesture that looked automatic because it was, and which indicated good instincts. And Gideon noticed all of this with the feelings of a man watching someone else handle a thing he knows he left behind. Edmund stayed 20 minutes. When he came out, he looked up the street in the direction of Gideon's shop, and for a moment they were looking at each other across the road and the morning, and Edmund gave a small nod that Gideon returned, and then Edmund turned and went toward the bank, and Gideon turned back to his workbench. He picked up his tools. He thought about Naomi's face when she'd said, "Pleasant is not the same as dependable." He worked. It was around this time, the week after the storm, the slow and complicated days following it, that Gideon started to understand properly what Naomi had actually been telling him all along. Not just the words of it, which he'd heard clearly enough and spent considerable energy arguing with, but the thing underneath the words, which was a specific and particular kind of knowledge. She had been married. She had been married to a man who offered things, beautiful things, convincing things, the kind of things that sound like a future when you're listening to them. And she had believed those things, and she had paid for believing them with years of her life and every dollar they'd had, and the specific kind of tiredness that comes from waiting for something that isn't coming. Her husband had been charming. Gideon knew this not because Naomi had said it outright. She didn't talk about her marriage with any frequency. And when she did, it was in the careful language of someone who has put something behind them and is not interested in turning around. But because of the things she didn't say, and the way she watched men who made large gestures, and the very particular expression that crossed her face when Edmund Hale gave one of his easy, confident speeches about the future of Red Hollow. It was not the expression of a woman who was impressed. Gideon thought about this. He thought about it while he worked and while he walked home and while he sat at his table eating dinners that were functional rather than good, which was the usual quality of meals made by a man who views cooking as a problem to be solved rather than an activity to be enjoyed. He thought about what it meant to have learned the difference between a promise and a presence, and how you learned that, and what it cost. He had his own version of that lesson, though shaped differently. His had been quick and clean, the way some wounds are. One afternoon, one conversation, one discovery that the thing he'd been certain of was not certain at all, and had possibly never been. He'd been 26 and certain in the way that 26 can be, and then he wasn't. And he had spent the following 2 decades converting that certainty into caution in the particular way that men do when they decide it's safer to be careful than to be wrong again. What he was starting to see, slowly, with the resistance of a man who doesn't like revising conclusions, was that caution and wisdom were not the same thing, and he had been treating them as if they were. This was not a comfortable realization. He set it aside and kept working. Edmund Hale called on Naomi 4 more times in June. The town observed all 4 visits with the attentiveness it had developed on the subject, and the consensus remained that Edmund was pleasant and reliable and a genuinely fine addition to Red Hollow, and also that something was off, though nobody could say with precision what. What was off, had anyone thought to ask Naomi, was that she was doing something she had not done with her late husband, which was watching very carefully for the gap between what a person said and what a person did. She had not known to do that the first time. She knew now. And what she was seeing with Edmund Hale, who was in most respects an admirable person, was that the gap was not enormous, but it was present and consistent. He talked about the community improvements he was planning. She waited to see which ones materialized. Some did. Some didn't. And when they didn't, he had good explanations, which were convincing explanations. And she filed the convincing explanations in the same drawer where she kept the memory of her husband's convincing explanations, which was a drawer she checked periodically and did not enjoy revisiting. She was not being unfair to Edmund. She knew she wasn't being unfair. She was being thorough, which was different, and which was her right after what thoroughness had cost her the first time. She was also, if she was being honest with herself, comparing him to a standard that Edmund Hale had not set and could not control, which was the standard of a man who showed up on her roof in a storm without being asked and handed her salve for his own bleeding hands the morning after. She was trying to be fair about that too. One afternoon in late June, she ran into Martha Devlin at the general store, and Martha, who was 63 and had been in Red Hollow since before it was called Red Hollow, and had the social standing of someone who had earned the right to say whatever she thought, looked at Naomi over a bolt of calico and said, "You know what your problem is?" "I have a feeling you're going to tell me," Naomi said. "Your problem is you know exactly what you want and you're being very polite about other options." Naomi looked at the calico. "I don't know what you mean." "Edmund Hale is a fine young man," Martha said, folding the calico with the authority of someone who has folded a great deal of calico. "And he will make some woman very happy. He will make her speeches and bring her apple cake and take her to the dance, and she will be pleased with that because she hasn't seen the other kind." Naomi said nothing. "You have seen the other kind," Martha said without looking up from her folding, "and you are standing in a general store being polite about apple cake when what you're actually thinking about is a man with a bad leg who fixed your roof in the rain and didn't mention it afterward." "He mentioned it," Naomi said. "Did he?" "He told me to go inside and get something to catch the water." Martha stopped folding and looked at her. Something that was not quite a smile happened on her face. "Well," she said, "that does sound like him." Naomi put her flour on the counter and didn't say anything else, and Martha had the grace not to press further. And that was the end of the conversation. But Naomi thought about it on the walk home and found that she had very little to argue with. The thing Gideon didn't know because Naomi had not told him and he had not asked, was that she had made her decision about Edmund Hale the night of the spring dance. Not at the dance. The dance had been fine. Edmund was a good dancer and an attentive companion and had said several things that made her laugh, which she gave full credit for. The dance had been genuinely pleasant. The problem was that pleasant had a ceiling, and she could see the ceiling clearly, and it was lower than she wanted. What had settled it was the walk home. Edmund had walked her back and stood on her step in the dark, and he had said, and he had meant it, she believed he had meant it, that he admired her greatly, that she was unlike any woman he'd met in Red Hollow or anywhere else, and that he hoped she would consider allowing him to call on her more seriously. It was a good speech. It was probably the best speech she'd heard from a man in 10 years. She had thanked him and told him she would think about it, and she had gone inside and stood in the dark of her bakery. The flour smell and the low warmth from the banked oven and the familiar creak of the floorboard she kept meaning to fix. And she had realized that she could not think of a single thing Edmund Hale had done that she had not expected him to do. Every gesture had been appropriate. Every word had been correct. He had arrived when he said he would arrive and done what he said he would do. And none of it had surprised her, because it was all the kind of thing that a careful, charming man does when he is trying to make a particular impression. She had stood in her bakery in the dark and thought about what it would feel like to know, with certainty, every evening, that what was coming was exactly what had been promised. And then she had thought about icy steps in February that were clear without explanation, and flour bills covered without announcement, and a man sitting on a crate with a saddle across his knees and his jaw doing something tight and unhelpful when she asked him direct questions. And she understood that she was not interested in certainty of the predictable kind because she had lived with unpredictability before and survived it. And what she wanted was a different thing entirely. She wanted someone who did things she hadn't thought to ask for. She hadn't told Gideon any of this. She had told him that Edmund was persistent. She had watched his face go careful and non-committal, and she had thought, not for the first time, that this man was going to be the absolute end of her patience if he kept this up. It was Gideon's habit, on the last Friday of every month, to check in on the older residents of Red Hollow who had nobody else to check in on them. He didn't announce this. He had been doing it for 6 years, and it was simply part of the structure of the month, the way the flour delivery was part of Tuesday, and the account books were part of Sunday evening. Mrs. Garfield was on the list. Old Pete Sutton, who had been a trapper until his knees gave out and now sat on his porch and maintained strong opinions about weather. The Whitmore family, who weren't old but who were struggling in ways that required practical assistance rather than sympathy. Gideon brought things, wood usually, or food, or a repaired piece of equipment, or in the Whitmore case, an envelope that appeared in their door sometime before dawn on the last Friday of the month and was never discussed. He had added the Whitmore family to his list 8 months ago after he'd overheard, not meaning to, genuinely not meaning to, Dan Whitmore telling his wife in a low, careful voice outside the general store that the winter bill from the doctor was going to mean they came up short on feed for the animals, and that he didn't know how they were going to cover it, and that he was sorry, which was the word that broke something in Gideon's chest clean in half, because the man was saying it like it was his fault, like a man apologizes for weather. He had not told Naomi about any of this. Naomi found out about the Whitmores on a Tuesday in late June, when Clara Whitmore came into the bakery for a half loaf of the cheap bread, the kind that held together rather than tasted like anything, and paid for it with coins that had clearly been counted and recounted several times before leaving the house. Naomi sold her the half loaf. She also, in what appeared to be a completely separate transaction involving a box of day-old rolls that needed to go before they hardened, pressed that box into Clara Whitmore's hands and explained at some length that she was doing her a favor, really, because otherwise she'd have to throw them out. Clara Whitmore took the rolls. Her expression while she did it was the expression of a woman who knows she is being given charity and who is too tired to find the energy to refuse it, and Naomi recognized that expression because she had seen it before in the mirror, back before she'd learned how to be something other than tired. Afterward, when the shop was quiet, Naomi mentioned to her youngest employee, a 16-year-old named Bessie, who observed most things in Red Hollow and had opinions about all of them, that she hadn't realized the Whitmores were having a hard time. Bessie said, somewhat tentatively, that they'd been managing, that someone had been helping with the bills, that she didn't know who exactly, but the Whitmores had said something about an envelope that showed up, that her mother thought it was probably someone at the church, but that the timing never matched up right with any of the church people. Naomi thought about this for a moment. She thought about a man who noticed things and didn't announce them. "An envelope," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She thought about that for the rest of the day. She thought about it while she shaped the evening bread, and while she did the accounts, and while she swept the floor, and what she concluded by the time she locked the door was that she was dealing with a man who had built an entire private life of small kindnesses that he didn't intend anyone to see, and that this was either the most genuinely decent thing she had ever encountered, or it was a strategy so subtle it was nearly invisible. And she had spent enough time with Gideon Mercer to know with certainty that it was not a strategy. It was just who he was. Which, she thought, walking home in the summer evening with her shoes raising small clouds of dry dust, made his conviction that he wasn't good enough for her the most absurd and maddening thing she had ever personally witnessed. She went to his shop on a Thursday afternoon. She didn't have a reason prepared, which was unusual for her. Naomi generally arrived at conversations with some idea of where she intended them to go. She went because she was done waiting for him to come to a conclusion on his own, because that strategy had now been in operation for 2 years and had produced an amount of progress she could only describe as insulting. The shop smelled of tallow and leather, and the particular kind of quiet that settles into a workspace when someone has been alone in it for a long time. Gideon was at the back bench, working on something that required both hands and most of his attention, and he looked up when she came in and did the thing he always did, which was become very still. "Naomi?" he said. "Do you have 5 minutes?" she said. It wasn't exactly a question. He set down his tools. She came to the bench and stood on the other side of it, which was either practical or symbolic, and she was not going to examine which. She looked at his hands, better than they'd been, the cuts mostly healed, still a little stiff at the knuckles. She looked at him. "I told Edmund no," she said. Something moved in his face. He controlled it quickly, but not quite quickly enough. "Naomi, I told him I appreciated his attention, and that I thought very highly of him, and that I didn't think we were right for each other," she said. "He was gracious about it. He is a gracious person. I told him I hoped he'd stay in Red Hollow and find someone who suited him better, and I meant that." She put her hands flat on the bench, on either side of the half-finished piece of leather he'd been working on. "And now I'm here." "You didn't have to do that," he said, and his voice was rough in a way that wasn't about the shop or the tools or anything she could see. "I did it because it was honest," she said. "I'm not interested in spending time with someone I'm not interested in just to make a point. I'm too old for that." She looked at him directly. "I'm here because I want you to stop hiding. Not from me, from yourself." His jaw did the tight thing. "I'm not hiding." "You are," she said, not unkindly. "You have spent 2 years doing things for me that no one else would do, and then convincing yourself they don't count. You covered bills without asking. You cleared my steps every winter morning. You came to my roof in a storm on a leg that is— I've seen it, Gideon. I know how bad it was that night. And you did all of that, and then you stand in this shop and tell me you're not a good option." She paused. "Where did that come from?" He was quiet for a long moment. The shop made its small sounds around them. A creak somewhere, the distant noise of the street outside. "A long time ago," he said finally. "A long time ago I was certain about something. And I was wrong, and I paid for it. And I decided not to be wrong about that kind of thing again." "What happened?" He looked like he was going to not answer. Then he looked like a man who has run out of reasons to not answer. "I was 26, he said. I thought things were settled. Between me and a woman I'd known 3 years. I thought we were settled." He stopped. "She disagreed." "She left you." "She told me she was marrying someone else. Someone I thought was— I hadn't known there was a competition." He said it without drama, just the flat reporting of something old. "She said I was reliable, that I was the most reliable person she knew, and that she didn't want reliable. She wanted—" He made a short gesture with one hand that finished the sentence without words. Naomi was quiet. "Reliable," he said, "was not a compliment." "Gideon," she said his name carefully, the way you set something fragile down. "She was 20-something and she didn't know what she had. That's not a verdict on you. That's just someone who hadn't learned yet." "Maybe," he said, "but it's a lesson that stays." "I know," she said. I have some of those too. She looked at him. Mine told me that charming was not the same as good, and I learned it at considerable expense, and I know what I'm looking at now. She moved her hands off the bench, straightened. I'm looking at a man who I have watched, for 2 years, be every single thing I know matters. And who cannot believe that those things matter to me? He didn't look away. That was something, at least. I'm not asking you for anything grand, she said. I'm not asking you for speeches or promises or any of that. I'm just asking you to stop deciding for me. She picked up her basket. I'm asking you to let me decide. She walked to the door. At the door she paused and turned back because she had learned, with Gideon, that leaving things unsaid was not the same as leaving them unneeded. You covered the Whitmore's doctor bill, she said. He said nothing. His expression gave nothing away, which was itself confirmation. Dan Whitmore came in last week, she said. He didn't say it directly, but he talked around it enough that I understood. She looked at him. You have been quiet about so many things, Gideon. Don't be quiet about this one. She left. He stood in his shop for a long time after the door swung closed. Outside, Red Hollow did what it did in the long summer afternoons. Moved slowly, loudly, without much urgency, and inside the tallow smell settled around him and the half-finished piece of leather waited on the bench, and he stood there with 22 years of careful caution stacked on one side and one woman's clear eyes on the other. It was not by any measure a balanced scale. He sat down at his bench. He picked up his tools. He worked until dark. He went home. He lay awake for a while looking at the crooked beam in his ceiling and thinking about a woman who had told him in a leather shop in the middle of a Thursday afternoon exactly what she thought and exactly what she wanted and exactly what she was offering, and who had done it without grand gestures or beautiful words, just with the level and unblinking honesty of someone who had learned that honesty was the only currency worth spending. He thought about that. He thought about what it meant for a man to be known, not flattered, not charmed, not managed, but actually quietly, consistently known, in the specific way of someone who had been watching carefully enough to notice icy steps and flower bills and the difference between what he said and what he did. He thought about 22 years. He thought about how long 22 years was to carry something before you set it down. He didn't make any decisions that night. He wasn't ready for that yet. But something that had been very fixed in him was moving, slowly, the way frozen ground moves in spring. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the particular unstoppable way of things that are finally ready to become something else. He lay there in the dark and let it move. The days that followed Naomi's visit to the shop had a particular texture to them. Not quite tense, not quite resolved, but charged in the way the air gets before weather. Gideon went to work. He passed the bakery. She was at the door some mornings, and not others, and when she was, they exchanged the same nod they always had. But it was a different kind of nod now, loaded with things that had been said and things that hadn't, and they both knew it, and neither of them pushed. He was thinking. She was letting him. That was a kindness he recognized, even if he didn't say so. What he did, in those 10 days between her visit to the shop and the second storm, was something he hadn't done in 22 years. He let himself sit with the possibility that he might not be wrong about her. Not that he was right, not yet, not with any confidence, but that the argument he'd been making against himself was maybe not as airtight as he'd believed. He examined it the way he examined damaged leather, methodically, looking for where the structure was actually failing versus where it only looked like it was. What he found, turning it over in the long evenings at his workbench, was that most of what he knew about his own unworthiness was based on evidence that was 22 years old and sourced from a woman who, as Naomi had said plainly, had not known what she had. He had taken that single verdict and built a courthouse around it and presided over it ever since, and he was beginning to see, slowly, without any particular drama, that the case might not have been as settled as he'd decided it was. This did not make him feel immediately better. It made him feel the specific discomfort of someone who has been wrong about something important for a very long time and is just now reckoning with the size of the wrongness. It was not a comfortable feeling. He worked through it, the way he worked through most things. He also, on the second Friday of the month, left the Whitmore envelope as usual, and this time he stood at their door for a moment longer than usual before going, Not for any particular reason, except that he was starting to notice the things he did that he'd stopped noticing because they'd become so automatic. He was starting to see them the way Naomi apparently saw them, which was as evidence of something. And the something made him uncomfortable, not because it was bad, but because it made her argument harder to dismiss. He went home. He ate his functional dinner. He looked at the crooked beam. He thought, 10 more days. He gave himself 10 more days to think, and at the end of them, he was going to have to either say something or stop expecting her to wait for a man who couldn't get out of his own way. He got 7. The second storm announced itself differently than the first. The first had been urgent and obvious, a night sky that turned the color of an old bruise and wind that told you plainly what was coming. This one was slower, more patient, the kind of storm that builds over 2 days and arrives with more force than you planned for because you'd gotten used to it on the horizon and stopped accounting for how much it was growing. By the 3rd day of July, the sky over the northern range had a color in it that made the old-timers in Red Hollow go quiet in a particular way. Not panicked. They'd seen weather before, but watchful. The barometric drop was significant enough that Gideon's leg, which had been adequately functional for 10 days, began making its case again with renewed conviction sometime around midday. He finished the work he had orders for. He checked the shutters on his shop and the latch on the back door and the roof. His own roof, which was in good condition because he'd replaced the shingles 2 autumns ago and done the job properly. Then he stood at the window of his front room and looked at the sky and thought, involuntarily, about the north-facing slope of the bakery and the boards they'd nailed up in June. They had done a decent job that night. He knew they had. He'd assessed the work in daylight 2 days later, from the road, in the completely incidental way of a man whose route happened to take him past. The boards were holding. The shingles around them had been checked. It was not a permanent repair, but it was a solid temporary one, and a normal storm would not challenge it. This was not shaping up to be a normal storm. By 7 in the evening, the wind had begun and the light had gone the flat gray-yellow color that precedes serious weather, and Red Hollow was doing what frontier towns do before a big storm, which was nail things down and bring animals in and fill every available container with water against the possibility that things would need cleaning up before the supply recovered. Gideon did his own preparations quickly and efficiently and without drama, and then he stood at his window and watched the sky and told himself that the bakery repairs were fine, that he'd done them well, that there was no reason to be standing at his window thinking about a north-facing roof slope. He told himself this for approximately 35 minutes. The wind outside had developed a sound that was not the regular voice of moving air, but something lower and more purposeful. The sound of a substantial amount of pressure doing organized work on everything in its path. He put on his coat. He was not going to think about it. He was going to walk over and look at the roof from the road, make sure the boards were holding, and walk back. That was all. That was a reasonable and practical thing to do, and it was not. He was clear about this with himself. It was not an excuse to be near her because she would probably be inside, sensibly, where a person should be in this kind of weather. He stepped out his front door and the wind immediately demonstrated that it had opinions about where he should be going, which were approximately opposite to his own. He leaned into it and walked. He could see from half a block away that something was wrong. Not with the north-facing slope. That repair was holding, which he registered with a distant satisfaction. But with the back section of the roof, the part that faced east, which had not been touched in June because it hadn't needed touching in June. In June, that section had been fine. Tonight, it was not fine. A substantial portion of the original roofing had been partially lifted, and the battens underneath were visible, and the whole thing was moving in the wind in a way that indicated it was working on a decision. He didn't have time to think about whether this was wise. He didn't have time to think about his leg or the ladder or the last time or any of it. He moved around the back of the building, and the yard was already dark and the wind was doing serious work now, and he found the ladder where it had been since June, leaning against the back wall, because Naomi had apparently made the same assessment he had and had it standing ready, and he set it against the eave and put his foot on the first rung. The back door opened. She was already in her coat. She had the lamp in one hand and a hammer in the other, and she looked at him with an expression that was not surprise. "I saw it 20 minutes ago," she said, raising her voice over the wind. "I was going to—" She looked at the ladder, then at him, then at the roof. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough," he said. I need someone to hand me things. I know, she said. There was something very settled in her voice, not calm exactly, but resolved. The voice of a woman who has made her assessment and is done deliberating. She set the lamp inside the door where it wouldn't blow and came to the foot of the ladder. Go, I'm right behind you. Naomi, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. She was already at the second rung. Move. He moved. The east section was worse than it had looked from the road. 3 full sections of shingles had lifted and 2 of them were barely attached, hanging on the edge of coming loose entirely, which would have opened the bakery ceiling to whatever the storm decided to do next. And what the storm was deciding to do was considerable. The wind up on the roof was a different animal than the wind at ground level. It had no manners up there, came from multiple directions simultaneously, and made a sound against the exposed wood that Gideon's body responded to before his brain caught up. Tell me what you need, Naomi said. She was flat against the ridge, her weight distributed the way he'd shown her in June without meaning to teach her anything, and she had the bag of nails he'd had in his coat pocket and the spare boards he'd grabbed from the yard on his way up, and she was watching him with complete focus and no visible panic. Hold that section, he said, pointing, both hands flat on it. Don't let it lift again. She moved. She was fast. He'd noticed that in June, too, the economy of her movements when something needed doing, no wasted motion. She had her hands flat on the section and her weight behind it before he'd gotten his tools out. He worked. His hands were remembering this now. The particular problem of hammering at an angle in wind, the way wet wood behaves differently than dry. The need to sink the nail fast before the wood shifted. His leg had voiced its complaints on the climb up and had since gone quiet in the way it sometimes did under serious circumstances, as though the body recognized that there were more pressing concerns and tabled the pain for later review. The first section took 20 minutes. The wind made it 40. Other side, he said. 3 feet over, the one that's half up. She shifted, moved fast. Her hands went flat on the section and she said, this one's further gone than the other. I know. Keep pressure on it. I am keeping pressure on it. More. Gideon, I am keeping as much pressure on it as I have. He got there and got his hands on it beside hers, and for a moment they were both holding the same piece of buckling wood against the same wind, and the closeness of it, the unavoidable proximity on a narrow roof in the dark, was something he was absolutely not thinking about. I'm going to nail the corner first, he said. Then you can ease off. All right. When I say, I understood you the first time. He nailed the corner. She eased off. He moved along the section, working fast, the hammer finding the rhythm it found when things were urgent and there was no room for uncertainty. They did not talk much. They communicated in the shorthand of people doing physical work together under pressure, directions, confirmations, the occasional sharp word when something didn't go as planned. At one point, a section of the lifted shingle tore completely free and went over the edge, and Naomi said something that Gideon had genuinely not expected her to know, and under other circumstances he might have smiled. The rain started on the second hour. It came in sideways, which was its preference, and within 5 minutes the roof was a different surface than it had been. Slicker, less forgiving, requiring different foot placement and more attention to where the weight was. Gideon adjusted. Naomi adjusted. She slipped once, her foot going out from under her on a wet section, and his hand caught her elbow before he'd thought about catching it, and she got her footing back fast and said, I've got it, in a tone that suggested she was more annoyed at the roof than at her own footing, and he believed her. There's one more, she said from the far side of the ridge, her voice raised over the rain. Behind you, southwest corner. He looked. She was right. I see it. Do you need me over there? Stay on the ridge. Your side is steadier. My side, she said, is absolutely not steadier, but I'll stay on it. He worked his way to the southwest corner. This section was the worst of them. Had been working loose for longer, probably. The wood more compromised, requiring more nails and more specific placement. His arms were burning by then in the way arms burn when they've been doing sustained heavy work without rest, and his leg had reintroduced its concerns at some point around the 90-minute mark and was now making a thorough case. He worked anyway. There was nothing else to do. The last nail went in sometime around what he estimated was the 3rd hour. He couldn't be certain. His sense of time had gotten simple and utilitarian up there, reduced to the duration of each task rather than anything measurable. He sat back on the ridge and looked at what they'd done, and the rain was still coming, but the sections were holding and the wood was staying where it was supposed to stay. He exhaled. From the other side of the ridge, Naomi said, "Is that it?" "That's it." A silence. Then, "My arms are going to complain about this tomorrow." "Yes," he said. "They are." She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a groan. He turned and looked at her across the ridge. Wet, hair plastered flat, hands on her knees, breathing with the particular deliberateness of someone who has been working hard and is now allowing their body to register it. She looked, in the rain and the dark, profoundly real, in a way that polished things never do. She looked up and found him looking at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The rain was still falling, but the worst of the wind had moved past. He could feel it, the slight easement of pressure, the storm making its way south and taking its full force with it. What remained was ordinary rain, the aftermath kind which still required a coat but did not require bracing against. "You knew this section was at risk," she said. Not an accusation, an observation. He didn't answer immediately. "You've been watching my roof," she said, "since you fixed the first part, haven't you?" "I walked past," he said. "Gideon." He looked at the wet wood under his hands. The east section had a bad join on two of the battens. I noticed it in June when I was checking the repair. I thought it would hold through the summer. "You should have told me." "I know." "Why didn't you?" He was quiet. The rain said things that he didn't. "Because telling me about my roof," she said, slowly, working it out as she said it, "would have meant coming to me with something I needed, and you decided you weren't going to do that anymore." She was watching him. "You were trying to take yourself out of my life, quietly, without saying so." He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. "That," she said, "is probably the most frustrating thing you have ever done, and you have done some profoundly frustrating things." "Naomi." "No," she said. "I want you to hear this." She straightened on the ridge, the rain running off her coat, and she looked at him with the expression she had when she was done waiting for the other person to come to the point. "I was scared up here tonight. When I saw the roof and I knew I couldn't do it alone, the first thing I thought was, not the bakery, not the flour, not everything I'd built in 4 years. The first thing I thought was, where is Gideon?" She let that sit. "That's what I was scared about. You, not the roof." He was very still. "So you can stop," she said. "You can stop taking yourself out quietly, because I notice every time you do, and it doesn't work, and it just makes me angry, and I don't want to be angry at you." The rain ran down her face, and she didn't wipe it away. "I want to stop being angry at you." "You should be angry at me," he said. His voice was rough and low. "I've spent 2 years." He stopped, started again. "I've made every decision that should have been yours, about what you needed, about what was good enough for you. I decided you deserved someone better, and then I acted on it without asking if that was what you wanted, and that's—" He searched for the right word and found it somewhere it had been waiting. "That was wrong. That was not my right." She looked at him. The rain was quieter now. "No," she said quietly. "It wasn't. I'm sorry for it." Those 3 words, from a man who didn't produce them easily, sat between them with more weight than longer speeches. She nodded. Something in her face went easier, the way a knot releases when the right tension is found. "I know you are." He looked at her. He had been looking at her for 2 years from a careful distance, and sitting on this roof in the rain, he was close enough to see the things the distance had kept unclear. The tiredness around her eyes from 4:30 mornings, the line at the corner of her mouth that came from years of being the one person in the room who was paying attention to everything. The particular quality of her steadiness, which was not the steadiness of someone who didn't feel things, but of someone who had learned to feel things and work at the same time. She was 35 years old, and she had built something from $37 in her own hands, and she had done it without anyone's help and without asking for credit. She had watched him for 2 years with those attentive eyes, and she had not once tried to change him or correct him or make him into something easier, and she had said clearly and more than once exactly what she wanted, which was him. Just him. Not a different version, not a fixed version. Him, bad leg and bad decisions, and 22 years of misplaced caution, and all of it. There was a woman, he said. Not because the moment called for it exactly, but because he understood finally that carrying it alone had cost him 2 years, and he was done paying that particular price. Before Red Hollow, long before. I told you some of it. You told me she chose someone else. She said I was reliable like it was an insult, he said. She said she didn't want reliable. She wanted someone who made her feel... He stopped, looked at the wet wood. I never knew the right word for what she wanted, just that I wasn't it, and I told myself that settled something about what I was, about what I could offer a woman worth offering anything to. Naomi was quiet, listening in the way she listened, which was completely and without filling the space. I should have let that go a long time ago, he said. I know that. I've known it for a while now, if I'm... He almost said honest, but honesty had always been his default, so he said, if I'm clear about it. I've been holding on to it because it was easier than being wrong again. Gideon, she said, and her voice had something in it that was careful and direct at the same time. She was wrong. Not about what she wanted, that's her own business, but about what reliable meant. She was young, and she didn't know yet. A pause. I know exactly what it means and what it costs the person who is, and what it's worth to someone who actually needs it. She held his eyes. And I need it, not because I'm weak, because I've had the other thing and I know the difference. He sat with that. The rain came down gentle now. Just rain, just water, ordinary weather with no malice in it. I don't make speeches, he said. I've noticed. I don't have Edmund Hale's "if you say his name one more time," she said, and there was a tired affection in it that was better than patience. I am going to nail your boot to this roof. Something happened in his chest that he did not have a useful word for. Something cracked open, maybe. Something that had been closed for 22 years and had been working on opening for 2 and had finally found the right combination of rain and exhaustion and a woman with a hammer. Naomi, he said. Still here, she said, still waiting. In the rain, on a roof, which I want you to remember when you tell this story someday. And he laughed. He had not laughed, genuinely, without managing it, in a very long time, and it came out rusty and real and surprised him as much as anything. And across the ridge she was looking at him with an expression that was warm and a little triumphant and entirely unguarded. There he is, she said softly. He looked at her in the rain. He thought about 22 years and 2 years and $37 and an envelope under the Whitmore door and icy steps in February and a woman who had handed him nails without commentary and now sat on a wet roof in the dark, waiting for him to catch up to what she'd already decided. He reached across the ridge. His hand, which had been doing carpentry for 3 hours and had the roughness of 11 years of leather work and the particular stiffness of bad joints in the cold, found hers. She turned her hand over. She held on. That was it. That was all. They sat on the roof in the quieting rain while Red Hollow went about its wet and battered business below them, and it was not a grand moment, and it was not a beautiful moment in the way that beautiful moments are supposed to be beautiful. His leg was giving him a comprehensive report. Her coat was soaked through. They were both going to feel this tomorrow in the specific and physical way of people who have spent hours doing hard things at a height. But she was holding his hand in the rain, and he was letting her, and the something that had been moving in him for 10 days had finally moved all the way through, and what was on the other side of it was quieter and larger than he'd expected. He had spent 22 years being careful. He had spent 2 years being careful about this specific woman, and she had waited with more patience than he deserved and without ever making him feel the debt of it. And she was still here, on a wet roof on a July night, holding his rough and damaged hand like it was not a question at all. They came down the ladder eventually. They had to. There were wet coats and a bakery to check for water damage inside, and a ladder to secure against the wall before the wind picked up again. Practicalities did not pause for rooftop moments, which was something Gideon had always known, and which was, he was realizing, one of the things he loved about the kind of life he'd chosen, that it kept you honest about what mattered by making you deal with it. Inside the bakery, in the lamplight, she checked the floor for water, and he checked the seams around the north section they'd repaired in June, and they were both efficient about it, and neither of them mentioned what had happened on the roof directly, because it didn't need to be mentioned. It was there. In the way they moved in the same space without bumping into each other's work, in the way she handed him the lamp when he needed it without being asked, in the way he told her the northwest seam was dry without her having to walk over to check. When they were done, she put water on the stove for coffee, because it was past midnight and they were both cold and wet and the stove was right there, and she didn't ask him if he wanted coffee, she just put the water on. He sat at the small table in her back room that smelled of flour and warm cast iron and years of early mornings. She brought 2 cups and sat across from him and set one in front of him and wrapped her hands around her own. "Your leg," she said. "It's fine." "It is not fine. It's been worse." She looked at him over her cup. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'm going to make breakfast, and you're going to eat it sitting down, and your leg is going to have the morning off, and you are not going to argue with me about it." He opened his mouth. "That wasn't a question," she said. He closed his mouth. She had the look she sometimes got, the one that was stern on the surface and something entirely different one layer down, the look that had been driving him to distraction for 2 years without his permission. "All right," he said. She nodded, drank her coffee. Outside the window, Red Hollow dripped steadily into the dark, settling back into itself after the storm. The way places do when the worst has passed and what's left is just ordinary life waiting to be lived. He drank his coffee. His leg ached. His hands were stiff. He was sitting in Naomi Ashcroft's bakery at midnight with wet clothes and 22 years of caution, finally beginning to feel like what it was. Not wisdom, not protection, just weight that he'd been carrying so long he'd mistaken it for part of himself. He was putting it down. Not all at once, not without effort, but he was putting it down, and she was sitting across from him watching him do it with the steady patience of a woman who has done a fair amount of difficult things herself and knows that most of them take longer than you think they will. He finished his coffee. He stood up, carefully, and his leg made its position clear on the matter of stairs and roofs and long evenings. And she stood too, and for a moment they were both just standing in her small back room in the lamplight, close and quiet. "Thank you," she said, "for coming tonight." "You would have managed," he said. "Maybe." She looked up at him. "But I'm glad I didn't have to." He nodded. He went to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at her. And she was watching him with the expression he'd spent 2 years misreading and 2 months beginning to read correctly. And he said, "Tomorrow, breakfast." 7 o'clock, she said. "Don't be late." He went out into the dripping dark and walked home through the quiet streets of Red Hollow with his bad leg and his wet coat and the particular feeling of a man who has set something heavy down and is not entirely sure yet what it feels like to walk without it. He was going to find out. He was at the bakery at 7 o'clock, not 7:05, not 6:58. 7 exactly, because Naomi had said 7, and he was a man who kept his arrangements, and also because he had been awake since 4:30 and had spent the intervening time doing the things he always did in the early morning, the slow, careful business of getting a bad leg functional, the coffee, the quiet, and then sitting at his table for an additional 40 minutes that were not productive in any measurable sense but that he needed anyway. He knocked on the back door, which felt odd. He had never knocked on her back door before. He had come to her roof in storms and cleared her steps in winter and left things on her bench without knocking on anything. And now he was standing at her door at 7 in the morning with his hat in his hands like a man paying a formal call, which was approximately what this was, and the formality of it felt strange in a way that was also right. She opened the door in her work apron, flower on her forearm up to the elbow, and looked at him with the expression of a woman who has been up since 4:30 and has accomplished several things since then. "You're exactly on time," she said. "You said 7. "I did." She stepped back to let him in. "The bread's already done. I made eggs." He came inside. The bakery back room was warm from the ovens, the particular dense warmth of a kitchen that has been working since before dawn, and it smelled the way it always smelled, yeast and butter, and the faint sweetness of the honey bread she made on Tuesday and Friday mornings. He had smelled it from the street for 2 years. Being inside the source of it was different in a way he didn't examine. She had set the small table with 2 plates and 2 cups, and the eggs were in a pan on the stove, and there was bread already sliced on a board, and it was the most ordinary thing imaginable. And he sat down with the careful movement of a man whose leg had reviewed last night's activities and filed a formal complaint. She noticed. She didn't say anything, which was better than noticing out loud. "How's the roof look this morning?" he asked. "I checked at 5. She slid the eggs onto both plates and brought them to the table and sat across from him. "The east section held. There's some water damage on the back wall, not bad. I'll need to get someone to look at the batten on the southwest corner when it dries out. The wood's soft in 2 places." "I can do that." She looked at him over her coffee. "Next week," he said. "When it's dry. And when—" He paused, made himself say it plainly. "When my leg is worth trusting on a ladder again." She nodded, ate her eggs. He ate his. Outside, Red Hollow was beginning its morning, the sounds of it filtering through the bakery walls. Horses, a cart, the particular voice of Walt Henley conducting business at unnecessary volume 2 streets over. "Bessie's going to have questions," Naomi said. "About what?" "About why the roof is repaired and there are 2 coffee cups on the table at 7 in the morning. He looked at his coffee cup, then at hers. "Bessie's 16. "Bessie," Naomi said, "is 16 and observes everything in a 4-block radius with the focus of a hawk and the memory of someone significantly older. She will notice the cups and she will draw a conclusion, and that conclusion will be around the town before noon." She said this without any particular distress. "I'm telling you so you're not surprised." He thought about that. He thought about Red Hollow and its attentions, and the 2 years of careful distance he'd maintained and what it would mean for that distance to be gone. Not just to him, to the town, which had opinions and would not keep them private. "Does that bother you?" he said. "What the town thinks?" "No." She said it immediately, no hesitation. "I spent 3 years worrying about what people thought of a widow who ran a bakery alone and had opinions about her own business. I don't do that anymore." She looked at him. "Does it bother you?" "No," he said, and found that it was true. She smiled. Not the polite one she used for customers, or the sharp one she used for negotiations. The real one, which he had seen rarely enough that he'd catalogued each instance. It changed her face in a specific way, took years off it, and put something younger and less guarded in their place. He looked at his eggs. He was aware that he was smiling too, which was not a thing he did with any frequency, and which his face was managing with some uncertainty. They finished breakfast. She refilled his coffee without asking. He drank it. Bessie arrived at 7:30 and took in the scene with the comprehensive assessment Naomi had predicted, and her expression did several things in quick succession before settling on professional neutrality, which she maintained for approximately 4 minutes before finding a reason to be in the back room again. "Miss Ashcroft," Bessie said, studying the breadboard with great attention, "do you need me to check the east wall for water damage?" "I already checked it," Naomi said. "I could check it again." Bessie: "Yes, ma'am." "Go open the front." Bessie went. Gideon finished his coffee. He stood up carefully and put on his hat, and Naomi walked with him to the back door the way you walk someone out when they are not a stranger and not quite a customer, and something that doesn't yet have an established name. At the door he stopped and turned, and she was close, closer than the usual distance they'd kept between them, and he was aware of it with a clarity that he hadn't allowed himself before last night. "Tonight," he said. "If you're not busy, I thought, if you wanted to walk." He paused. He was not practiced at this, had not been practiced at it for 22 years, and it showed. "In the evening, when you close up." She looked at him. Her expression had the warmth in it that he was still learning to read without immediately finding reasons to discount. "Yes," she said, simply. No conditions, no deliberations. "I'd like that." He nodded. He went out into the morning. He walked to his shop with his bad leg and his hat, and the particular feeling of a man who has said a frightening thing and survived it, which was new enough to be interesting. The walks became the shape of their evenings through July. Not every evening. They were both people with early mornings and full days, and the bakery had demands that didn't bend around personal schedules, and Gideon had 3 weeks of backed-up orders that needed working through. But 4 evenings a week, sometimes 5, he would be at her back door when she turned the lock, and they would walk the perimeter of Red Hollow in the long summer light the way people do when they are learning each other outside the context of crisis. It was different from the roofs and the storms and the charged shop conversations. Quieter, less urgent. It had the quality of something that was building without either of them pushing it, which was both better and harder than the urgent things, because the urgent things didn't leave room for doubt, and the slow things did. He had doubts. He was honest about this, at least with himself. Not the old doubt, not the fundamental question of whether he was worth anything to her, because she had answered that plainly enough that only willful stupidity could sustain it, but a different kind, smaller and more specific. The doubt of a man who had been alone for a very long time and had built a life around that solitude, and was now in the process of admitting another person into it, and finding the process both necessary and profoundly uncomfortable. He was not easy to be with. He knew this. He was quiet in ways that could read his absence, and he had habits that were long established and not particularly designed with anyone else in mind, and he had opinions about things that he expressed only when asked, and sometimes not even then, which Naomi had already demonstrated she found maddening. She was not easy to be with either, though her difficulties ran the other direction. She was direct to the point of bluntness on subjects she cared about. She had standards for her work and her bakery that she did not lower for convenience and did not apologize for. She was sometimes short with people before her second cup of coffee in the morning, and was aware of this and considered it a personal failing but had not yet fixed it. She made decisions quickly and trusted those decisions with a confidence that was usually warranted and occasionally wrong. And on the occasions it was wrong, she absorbed the wrongness and corrected and moved on without extensive self-examination, which was a quality that Gideon found both admirable and, given his own tendencies, almost incomprehensible. They talked on those walks about Red Hollow and the people in it, which they had different perspectives on because his work brought him the men and her work brought her everyone, and the comparison was frequently illuminating. About her late husband, eventually in pieces and over several evenings, not with grief, which had long since done its work and been set aside, but with the particular honesty of someone who has processed something enough to look at it directly. About his life before Red Hollow, which was not a subject he opened easily, but which she waited for with her specific brand of patience that was not passive but active. The patience of someone who is paying attention while they wait. One evening, a Tuesday in late July, they were sitting on the low wall at the edge of the mill road where the hill began, watching the light go off the distant range in the long, drawn-out way of summer evenings, and Naomi said, without preamble, "What do you want, Gideon? Not what you think is reasonable. What do you actually want?" He thought about it. He gave it the same weight he gave problems that required accuracy. "This," he said finally, "what we've been doing." She waited. He stopped, tried again. "I want to not be doing it alone anymore. The life of it. Not the work, not the practical. I don't mean someone to manage things. I mean," he was finding this harder than the roof, which at least had been physical. "I've been alone for a long time, and I told myself it was a preference, and it wasn't. It was just what I'd accepted." She was quiet beside him. The evening did its slow, indifferent thing with the light. "I want what I should have let myself want 2 years ago," he said. "You. Being honest with you. Not making decisions that were yours to make." He looked at the hills. "I want to build the thing, not the grand version, the regular version, the one that holds up." She didn't say anything for a moment. He waited because she had earned the right to think before she answered. "I want someone to come home to," she said. Not romantic exactly, just real, stated the way she stated things. "I've had the bakery for 4 years and it's mine and I love it and it's also the only thing I have, and I don't want it to be the only thing anymore." She looked at her hands, which had flour in the creases even after washing, which was the permanent condition of her hands. "I'm not afraid of being alone. I know how to do that. I'm tired of choosing it because there wasn't anyone worth changing it for." He turned and looked at her. She looked at him. And there was a thing in that look that was past the careful stage, past the reasonable stage, past the stage where either of them was managing the situation. Just two people in the evening light who had arrived, by the longest possible route, at the thing they'd both been circling. He reached out and took her hand. Not the practical grip of two people on a roof. Something else. She looked down at their joined hands with an expression that was not dramatic and not staged, just genuinely, quietly glad, the way a person looks when something they've been patient about finally arrives. "We've wasted a lot of time," he said. 2 years, she said. "Largely your fault." "Largely," he agreed. "Entirely." Naomi. She squeezed his hand. Entirely. And I'm not letting you negotiate it down. He made a sound that was the nearest thing to a laugh he'd produced in a public space in recent memory. She pressed her shoulder briefly against his arm, not leaning, just contact, the unself-conscious kind. And they sat on the wall in the summer evening until the light was gone, and Red Hollow, below them, had lit its lamps. He told her about Margaret on a Wednesday evening in August, which was something he had not intended to do and which happened anyway because Naomi had asked him a specific question and he had decided, sitting beside her on the low wall that had become their usual place, that he was done with the version of himself that answered carefully. Margaret had been 24 and he had been 26, and he had believed in the specific and unshakable way of young men who have decided something, that they were going to be married. He had not asked her yet. He had been saving, building toward the asking, planning the way he planned everything. And then one afternoon she had come to find him, and she had been kind about it, which was almost worse. And she had explained that she was going to marry Thomas Albright, who was 29, and had a manner about him that Gideon lacked, a particular ease in rooms full of people, a way of making the person he was talking to feel like the most important person present. She didn't say you were bad, Naomi said. No, she said I was good. She said I was good and steady, and that any woman would be lucky to have a man like me. He paused, and then she married Thomas Albright. And you heard the words and missed the problem with them. He looked at her. What problem? Any woman, Naomi said. She said any woman would be lucky. Not her, any woman. She was telling you she didn't feel lucky. She felt safe, and she didn't want safe. She looked at the distant hills. That's not a verdict on you. That's just a young woman who confused excitement with worth and made her choice accordingly. He sat with that framing. It was not new information, exactly. He had known for years, in a distant intellectual way, that Margaret's choice had been about her own preferences more than his failures. But there was a difference between knowing something and having someone say it plainly at close range. Thomas Albright, Naomi said with genuine curiosity. What happened to him? I heard he did well for himself for a while. Then I didn't hear anything. He paused. I left that part of the country not long after, came west. Running away, she said. Working, he said. Same direction, different description. She made the sound that meant she was accepting his version under protest. He had learned to identify that sound. Here's what I want you to understand, she said, turning to look at him directly. What Margaret couldn't see, what she didn't know yet to look for, I can see, because I have been on the other side of it. I married the man with the manner, the one who made everyone feel important when he walked in. She said it without bitterness, just with the flat accuracy of someone reporting a fact. He made me feel important for 2 years, and then the money started going and the plans started failing and the manner was still there, but there was nothing behind it. And I was the one who absorbed all of that. The debt, the embarrassment, the starting over. She looked at him steadily. I am not choosing you because you're safe, Gideon. I'm choosing you because I know the difference now, and what you are is not safe. What you are is real, and real is what I want. He listened to this. He let it in, instead of finding reasons to deflect it, which was something he was practicing. I've been wrong about myself, he said, for a long time. Yes, she said without softening it. I'm working on that. I know you are. She looked at him. I can see you doing it. She stopped, considered. It's not nothing, watching someone do that. It's not a small thing. He looked at her. What you did, what you built here, from what you had left after him, that's not a small thing either. She absorbed that. Her expression did something complicated and then settled. No, she said quietly. It wasn't. They sat with that for a moment, the equal weight of two people who had survived different versions of the same lesson. Then she said, I need a new batten on the southwest corner. He looked at her. You said you'd do it when your leg was better, she said. Your leg is better. My leg is adequately functional. That's what I said. Saturday? Saturday, he said. The proposal, which was not what either of them would have called it, though it was, happened on a Thursday evening in late August that was so ordinary that neither of them marked the date until later. He had been at the bakery that afternoon helping move a delivery of flour sacks that were heavier than the supplier had apparently understood a small woman and two teenage girls could reasonably manage. This had been a practical visit, not a planned one, and it had extended into the early evening because moving flour led to reorganizing the storage, and reorganizing the storage revealed that the shelf brackets on the far wall had pulled loose, and Gideon had the tools in his coat, and Naomi had the opinions about where the shelves should end up, and they had spent 90 minutes in fairly productive disagreement about bracket placement and shelf height and the logical arrangement of dry goods. Bessie had gone home. The other girl, Lily, had gone home. It was just the two of them in the back room in the lamplight, and the shelves were done, well done, solid, with brackets that were not going to pull loose again. And Naomi was making tea because it was that kind of evening, and Gideon was sitting at the table cleaning the tools he'd used. She brought the tea and sat across from him and looked at the shelves with the assessing expression she used on finished work. "They're straight," she said. "They're straight. The left one is maybe a quarter-inch higher." He looked. "It's level." The visual impression, "Naomi, it's level. I used a level." She pressed her lips together. "All right," she said. Drank her tea, looked at the shelves again. "They're good." "Thank you." She looked at him. He was cleaning a hand plane with the focused attention he gave to tools, which was the same attention he gave to most things. Complete, without rushing, as if the thing in his hands was the only thing that existed. She had watched him do this kind of thing for weeks now, and she still found herself watching, which was information she no longer tried to ignore. "I want to ask you something," she said. He looked up. She had thought about how to say this. She had thought about it for several weeks, actually, because she was a woman who considered her words before committing to them, and what she wanted to say was something she did not want to misstate. "I'm not going to wait for you to get around to it," she said. "I've determined that you'll get around to it eventually, but eventually is not specific enough for me. And I'm 35, and I've been patient for 2 years and several months, and I would like to get on with things." He was looking at her with that very still expression. "I want to marry you," she said. "Not right away, not with any pressure. I am not suggesting we do anything hasty, but I want you to know that's what I'm thinking, and I'm not going to pretend I'm not thinking it, and I'd like to know if you're thinking it too." She held his gaze. "And before you start listing the reasons you're not good enough, I will point to those shelves and invite you to reconsider." He was quiet for a long moment. Not the closed kind of quiet, the thinking kind. "I'm 48 years old," he said. "I know how old you are. I have a bad leg and a small shop. Gideon, I'm not saying it like a problem," he said, and his voice was different. Not rough, not defensive, but careful in a new way, the way of someone handling something they don't want to break. "I'm saying it because I need to say what's true out loud, in front of you, and have it not be a reason to stop." He set down the hand plane. "I have a bad leg and a small shop, and I'm bad at talking in the mornings before coffee, and I make the same meal for dinner 4 times a week, because I have not developed strong opinions about food. Salt pork," she said. "Mainly salt pork," he confirmed. "I have been alone for 22 years, and I have habits that go with that, and I'm not going to pretend the habits aren't there. I'm not the same as what you had when you were 25 and starting out. I cannot offer you." He stopped, started again. "What I can offer you is every bit of what I have, which is not nothing, but it is not. Gideon." Her voice had the quality it got when she'd heard enough. "What you have is the only thing I want. I don't need you to be 25. I've been 25. I need you to be exactly this. This specific person at this table who fixed my roof in a storm and fixed my shelves on a Thursday and has been covering the Whitmore bills for 8 months without telling anyone." She leaned forward slightly and her eyes were absolutely clear. "You are the most decent man I have ever known, and you have spent 22 years being ashamed of it. I'm asking you to stop." He looked at her for a long moment. "I've been wrong," he said. Not the careful phrasing from before, the managed admission, just the plain statement of it. "About what I'm worth. I've been wrong, and I've known it longer than I've admitted, and I have made your life harder because of it, and I am—" He paused on the word and said it anyway, because he owed it. "I'm sorry for it." "I know," she said quietly. "I want to be what you're saying I am," he said. "I'm not sure I know how." "You already are," she said. "You just have to believe it." He looked at the woman across the table from him. Flour in the creases of her hands, lamplight on her face, tea going cold in her cup, entirely and unhurriedly herself, and something in him that had been tight for 22 years let go so completely that he felt it physically, like tension leaving a held muscle. "Yes," he said. She blinked. "Yes, what? To what you asked?" He held her eyes. "I'm thinking it too. I've been thinking it longer than I've said." Her face did the thing it did when she was genuinely moved and was deciding whether to show it. She showed it. It was not dramatic, she was not a dramatic person, but it was entirely real, and he was learning that entirely real was worth more than he'd previously accounted for. "All right then," she said, and her voice was only slightly unsteady. "Good. Good," he said. They sat with that for a moment. The two of them at a small table in a flower-smelling bakery in a frontier town, having just decided something significant in the same tone they might use to agree on shelf placement. Then Naomi said, "Your tea is getting cold." He picked up his cup. She picked up hers. Outside, Red Hollow went about its evening business, entirely unaware and entirely indifferent. And inside the bakery the lamps burned low and the shelves were level and there was nothing left to negotiate. He walked home that night the long way, through the quiet streets in the August dark, and he was aware, with a clarity that was new and undefended, without the usual management, of what had changed and what the weight of it was. He was not the same man who had walked past that bakery for 2 years at 5:15 in the morning, nodding and moving on. That man had known exactly what he was and what he wasn't, and the knowing had been the walls, and the walls had been, he could admit it now, on a quiet street in the dark. The walls had been chosen, not built by circumstance, chosen, because certain things inside walls do not have to be risked. He had been wrong about himself. He had been wrong for 22 years with the specific stubbornness of a man who mistakes caution for wisdom. And a woman in a flower apron with level eyes and no patience for his misassessments had walked into his shop and his evenings and his rooftops and had simply refused month after month to agree with his conclusions about himself. He thought about what it meant to be known by someone who had looked at all of it, the bad leg, the old wound, the 22 years of managed distance, and had said, yes, this. Specifically, this. He reached his front door. He stood for a moment. He thought about a porch. He had heard her mention it once, months ago, barely in passing, that she'd always wanted somewhere to sit in the evenings and watch the light change, and that 2 people had promised her that porch, and neither had built it. She had said it the way she said things she'd given up expecting, matter-of-fact and without self-pity, and he had filed it the way he filed everything she said, without meaning to. He stood at his door in the August dark and thought about a porch. He went inside. He sat at his table. He got out a piece of paper and a pencil, and he started sketching dimensions because he did not make promises. He made things. And there was a porch to build. The sketches went through 4 versions before he was satisfied, which was 1 more than usual and 3 fewer than Naomi would have insisted on if he'd shown them to her, which he did not. He had dimensions on paper by the end of that August night, materials list by Friday, and lumber ordered from the mill outside town by the following Monday morning, because Gideon Mercer did not sit on decisions once he'd made them. The sitting had been the problem all along. The doing was the part he knew. He told no one. Not because he was keeping a secret exactly, but because announcing it would have made it about the announcement, and it wasn't. It was about a woman who had mentioned a porch once, in passing, without expecting anything, and a man who had been storing that information without knowing what he was going to do with it until a Thursday night in August when he finally understood. The lumber arrived on a Wednesday. He stacked it in his yard to season for a week, which was proper practice, and which also gave him time to finish the outstanding orders on his bench without leaving his customers waiting, because that was not the kind of man he was. He worked through the week. He visited Naomi in the evenings. He said nothing about the lumber in his yard. She came to his house for the first time on a Saturday afternoon in September, which was itself significant. She had never been inside, had stood at his door twice over the years on practical errands, and not gone further. He had asked her, without much lead-up, whether she wanted to see where he lived, and she had said yes in the same way she said most things, directly and without making it into a production. She came in and looked around with the attentive quiet she brought to new spaces. And he watched her look at his workbench in the corner and the books on the shelf that were few, but read to the binding, and the curtains that were functional and not decorative, and the crooked beam in the ceiling. That beam, she said. I know. It's been like that a while. 3 years. She looked at him. Why haven't you fixed it? He considered this honestly. No one else was looking at it. She was quiet for a moment. I'm looking at it. I know, he said. I'll fix it. She moved through the small house without comment, which was its own kind of comment. She had the quality, when she was assessing something, of becoming very focused and very still. And he had learned that the stillness meant she was deciding what she thought rather than managing what she expressed. She stopped at the back window that looked out onto the yard where the lumber was stacked under oilcloth. What's the wood for? She said. Project, he said. She turned and looked at him. He kept his expression even, which took some effort. What kind of project? She said. The kind that's not finished yet. She studied him for a moment with the look she used when she suspected she was being deliberately insufficient information. Then she let it go, which surprised him, and went back to looking at the yard. It's a good yard, she said. There's room for a garden on the south side. He looked at the south side. I don't garden. I know, she said. I do. He stood with the weight of that sentence, the easy and complete way she had dropped it, and understood that she was doing what she did, not making grand pronouncements, just stating things that were true and letting them settle. There's room, he said. There is, she agreed. 7. They married in October. It was not a large ceremony because neither of them wanted a large ceremony, and the town, to its credit, recognized this and contained its enthusiasm to the appropriate scope. Martha Devlin cried, which she denied afterward with great conviction. Walt Henley shook Gideon's hand for a long time without saying anything, which was its own kind of speech. Bessie managed the bakery on her own for the first time and was, by all accounts, completely competent, a fact she received with the composed satisfaction of someone who had known this would be the case. Edmund Hale attended. He had been told the news by the general mechanism of Red Hollow's information systems, which is to say, by everyone simultaneously. And he had responded with the genuine graciousness that was, Naomi had always maintained, his most reliable quality. He shook Gideon's hand and said he hoped they'd be very happy, and he meant it, and Gideon thanked him and meant that too. And it was one of those adult moments that is almost entirely decent and only slightly complicated and which both parties navigate without making it worse. Edmund left Red Hollow 3 months later, which the town discussed at some length before concluding that he'd always been better suited to somewhere larger, and which Gideon marked only in the sense that a man marks the resolution of something that has been pending. The wedding itself was a morning affair. Naomi had a bakery to run, which did not pause for personal milestones. And it was simple and honest and real in the particular way of things that aren't trying to be more than they are. She wore her best dress, which was dark blue and practical and suited her. He wore his good coat, which he'd had cleaned for the occasion, and which fit him the way it always had, without ceremony. They said what needed to be said in front of the people who mattered, and then ate the bread Naomi had made herself that morning, because of course she had, because she was that kind of person. Afterward, walking back to the house that was now both of theirs, she said, Your coat has a loose button. He looked down. I know. I'll fix it tonight. You don't have to... Gideon, the voice. I'll fix it tonight. He stopped arguing because he had learned over the preceding weeks when the thing was decided. They walked home in the October light, and it was not a grand moment, and it was not a beautiful moment in the staged sense, and his leg was giving its usual commentary on the cobblestones, and she was already thinking about tomorrow's flower order, he could tell by the expression, and none of that was wrong. All of it was right in the specific way that right things are, not perfect, just real and present and his. He started the porch the following week. He had the materials, the plans, the time, the backed-up orders were caught up. The new system he'd worked out with a part-time assistant was handling the shop 4 mornings a week, and his leg was in one of its cooperative phases that he'd learned not to trust entirely, but to use while it lasted. He started on a Monday morning, and he worked steadily, without rushing, which was his way with everything that mattered. Naomi asked about it once, early in the week. She came around the side of the house in the afternoon and found him setting the foundation posts, and she stood watching with her arms crossed and her head slightly tilted, the way she watched things she was trying to understand. What are you building? She said. He straightened, looked at the posts, looked at her. You mentioned a porch, he said, a while back. You said 2 people promised you one. She was very still. I'm not promising it, he said. I'm building it. She looked at the posts and then at him and then at the posts again. When she looked back at him, her face had the expression, not the professional one, not the customer one, not the managing a situation one, the one he'd first seen on a bakery stoop with bare feet and a coffee cup, the one that was entirely unmanaged and entirely hers. Gideon, she said. Her voice was not quite steady. Go back inside, he said gently. I'll be in before dark. She stood there for another moment. Then she turned and went back inside, and he turned back to his posts, and if she stood at the kitchen window for a while after that, neither of them mentioned it. The porch took 3 weeks. It was not the fastest build he'd ever done, and not the most technically demanding, but he gave it the same attention he gave everything. The joinery was tight, the boards were level, the railing was solid enough to lean on without testing it every time, which was how he assessed all structural work. He added a slight overhang at the front that would keep the rain off in bad weather because he'd thought about where it faced and what the prevailing weather came from. He thought about the 2 chairs they'd need eventually and left the right spacing for them. He did not tell her these things. She would see them. She saw them on a Friday afternoon when he came in and said simply, "It's done." She went out and walked the length of it and stood at the railing and looked at the hills in the distance and the way the evening light was coming off them, which was exactly the view he had positioned it for, because she had said once, on one of their Tuesday evening walks, that the light off the hills at this hour was the thing she liked best about Red Hollow that nobody else seemed to notice. He had noticed. She stood there for a while. He stood behind her, hands in his pockets, not saying anything, because it didn't need anything said. The overhang, she said finally. Rain comes from the northwest, he said. She put her hand on the railing, tested it, looked at the horizon. 2 people promised me a porch, she said, mostly to herself. 2 men, at 2 different times, and it seemed like such a simple thing, and neither of them... She stopped. Neither of them ever picked up a hammer. I know, he said. She turned around and looked at him, and her eyes were doing the thing they did sometimes. Not crying, just full of something that didn't have a clean category. He had learned not to look away when she looked at him like that, even though his instinct was still, sometimes, to find a reason to. You didn't promise it, she said. No. You just built it. That's generally how it goes, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she crossed the 3 feet between them and put her arms around him, which she had done before, but not quite like this. Not with the specific weight of someone setting something down, the relief of it, the finality. He put his arms around her and she pressed her face against his shoulder and they stood on the new porch in the Friday evening light, and he was aware, clearly and without any of the usual management, that this was the thing, this specific moment, this specific person, this porch that he had built not to impress anyone, but because she had wanted it, and he had the means to give it to her, and that was reason enough. After a while, she said into his shoulder, "It needs chairs." "I know," he said. 2 of them, facing the hills. "I was thinking the same thing." She pulled back and looked up at him. "When?" "Next week," he said. "Maybe the week after. I have a saddle order." "The saddle order can wait." "Mrs. Kellerman has been waiting 3 weeks." "Gideon!" The voice. But there was something in it that was not quite serious, the edge that meant she was arguing on principle rather than conviction. 2 weeks, he said. "I'll have the chairs done in 2 weeks." She considered this, nodded. "All right," she said, 2 weeks. He built the chairs in 10 days. What Gideon Mercer understood in the years that followed was something he could not have told you at 26 or even 46, but which had become, somewhere between the roofs and the storms and the flower-smelling mornings, as plain to him as the grain of good leather. Worth is not a fixed thing. He had believed that the verdict on him was entered early and final, the way some men believe in things that relieve them of having to keep looking. It was easier, in a way, to have been decided. To know the shape of yourself and stay inside it and not risk finding out you'd been wrong. What he had been wrong about was almost everything. Not in the catastrophic sense. He was not a bad man, had never been a bad man, had in fact been, quietly and without announcement, a fairly good one. But he had been wrong about what he deserved, and the wrongness had compounded over 22 years into a wall that had cost him things he could not get back and had nearly cost him the thing that mattered most. He thought about this sometimes on the porch in the evenings, sitting in the chair on the left with the hill view that Naomi had claimed as hers, and which she occupied every evening she wasn't too tired to sit, which was most evenings. She would be in her chair beside him, sometimes talking and sometimes not, and the light would do what the light did over the hills in whatever season it was, and Red Hollow below them would be conducting its ordinary business, and he would think about all of it, the years, the cost of them, the thing on the other side. The thing on the other side was this: the porch, the woman in the chair beside him, the flower smell that had gotten into his coat permanently now, which he no longer thought of as a shop smell but as a home smell, which was different. The crooked beam, fixed finally, because she was looking at it. The garden on the south side of the house, which she had planted in spring and which had produced tomatoes that were better than anything he'd eaten since childhood, and which she had brought to the Whitmore family in quantity without making it into a discussion. He had watched her do that, had watched her hand the basket to Clara Whitmore at the door with the same brisk competence she brought to everything, no performance of generosity, just the thing itself. Clara had thanked her, and Naomi had said it was too many tomatoes for two people, which was not entirely accurate, and Clara had known it was not entirely accurate, and they had both been fine with that, and Gideon had stood at the fence watching and understood that Naomi had been doing her own version of the Whitmore envelope for years, in her own currency, in her own way. He had never told her about the envelope. She had never told him about the tomatoes. They were, it turned out, the same kind of person in ways that had been invisible to both of them while they were busy being separate. There were things they disagreed about, because they were two people with formed opinions, and neither of them was the kind to pretend otherwise. She thought he kept the shop too cold in summer. He thought she took on too much in the weeks before the holidays and didn't sleep enough. She was sometimes short with him before her second coffee, and he was sometimes too quiet in the evenings when something was working in his head, and both of these things occasionally produced friction of the specific kind that comes from two people who are not performing their relationship but living inside it, which meant that the friction was real and so was the resolution of it. He had not known, before this, that friction could be evidence of something good. He had thought good things were smooth. He had been wrong about that too, and he was glad to be wrong. The town had its own relationship with Gideon and Naomi's story, which was the relationship that small towns have with the stories that happen inside them. Proprietary, affectionate, slightly embellished with each retelling. Martha Devlin told people she'd seen it coming from the first month Naomi arrived in Red Hollow, which was not accurate, but was the kind of inaccuracy that improves a story without damaging its essential truth. Walt Henley maintained that he'd told Gideon to say something 2 years before Gideon actually did, which was also not accurate, though Walt had certainly thought it. Bessie, who had watched the whole thing unfold from the bakery, said nothing to anyone and kept what she knew with the discretion of someone who had been entrusted with something real. What the town had, eventually, was the thing it had been quietly hoping for, not the drama of it, because the drama had been private and unglamorous and conducted on rooftops in the rain, but the result of it, which was visible every evening in two people on a porch, watching the same hills in the same direction with the unhurried quality of people who are not waiting for anything. Red Hollow had seen a lot of things come and go. Prospectors and dreamers and men who arrived with loud intentions and left quietly when the intentions didn't materialize. It had seen its share of charming promises and the wreckage they left behind. What it did not see very often, and what it recognized when it saw it, was the thing that Gideon and Naomi had built. Not the porch, though the porch was admirable construction, but the life under it. The ordinary, unannounced, daily chosen life of two people who had arrived at each other the hard way and were not taking the arrival for granted. Nobody made speeches about it. Nobody needed to. On a September evening, a year after the porch was finished, Naomi sat in her chair with a cup of tea going cold in her hands and said, without looking away from the hills, "I thought about leaving Red Hollow after my first year. The winter had been bad and the bakery was still uncertain, and I thought, maybe I'd picked the wrong town." Gideon looked at her. This was new information. "What made you stay?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "My steps were clear one morning," she said. "For no reason. Someone had been out before I was, in the dark, in the cold, and cleared them. and I hadn't asked anyone to, and I didn't know who had done it. She looked at her tea. And I thought, this is a town where someone does that, anonymously, before dawn. I thought that was worth staying for. He looked at the hills. His jaw did the tight thing. Gideon, she said. It was nothing, he said. I know that's what you think, she said. That's not what it was. They sat in the quiet for a moment. I was going to leave too, he said, before you came. The winter before you arrived. I'd been thinking about it for a year. Moving on, finding somewhere else, starting over somewhere I hadn't been for 11 years. He paused. I didn't. I don't know why exactly. It was a bad winter and I had orders to finish, and then it was spring and I hadn't left, and then you arrived. He was quiet. And then I wasn't going to leave. She turned and looked at him. He looked back at her. We almost missed each other, she said. Yes, he said. She absorbed that, set her cold tea on the railing, pulled her shawl up against the September chill that was beginning to come down off the mountains the way it always did when the season was turning. I'm glad we didn't, she said. So am I, he said. It was not a grand statement. It was not the kind of thing that gets remembered as a famous declaration or written down as wisdom. It was two people on a porch in the early evening of a September stating the plainest and most important truth they had. They were glad. For each other. For the staying. For the steps cleared in the dark and the roof fixed in the rain and the shelves leveled on a Thursday and the chairs built in 10 days because she had said 2 weeks and that was too long. For all of it. The whole improbable, costly, hard-won thing. The hills went on doing what they did with the evening light, which was the same thing they'd been doing before either of them arrived and would keep doing long after, indifferent and beautiful. The town below them moved through its evening routines. Somewhere, the Whitmore children were probably chasing each other through the yard in the last of the daylight. Somewhere, Bessie was closing up the bakery with the competence she no longer needed to prove. Gideon and Naomi sat on their porch. They had not built a perfect life. They had built a real one, which is harder and better and does not photograph as well. There were mornings that were difficult, and evenings that didn't resolve cleanly, and weeks when the bakery's demands and the shop's demands and the general weight of adult life pressed in from multiple directions simultaneously. There were conversations they had to have more than once before they had them right, and things they each got wrong and had to come back to, and adjustments that neither of them had expected to make, and both of them made anyway because the alternative was not this, not the porch, not the hills, not the particular quality of being in the same place as a person who knows exactly who you are and has chosen you specifically. That was what it came down to. Not perfection. Specificity. The specific choice made daily to show up and stay and do the thing. Not the impressive thing, not the announced thing, but the thing that was needed, in the way it was needed, by the person who needed it. Gideon had spent 22 years believing that was not enough. He had been wrong. He looked at his wife in the chair beside him, watching the last of the light leave the hills, and he thought, this is what enough looks like. Not grand, not finished, not without difficulty or cost or the ongoing labor of two imperfect people trying to build something that holds. Just this. The porch. The hills' souls. Her. Every evening.